Wear something simple. I told them you would come as soon as possible. Be discreet. When? Thursday, mid-morning. Jar Newman. He knows his way with sensory complaints. The name meant little. A man with a certificate and a polite manner, who would, in the best case, show me an axis from which to measure the problem. In the worst, he would produce a sentence that would give the tabloids even more to work with. I considered these outcomes with the same equal parts of dread and relief. To do nothing might be a moral stance of its own, but such refusal felt increasingly like retreat. I promised to go. When the line went dead, I lay with the faint hum of the city and the dim shape of the piano across the room. I had not yet decided whether opening the music closet and taking out the old scores of my life would be an act of desecration or of practical maintenance. For the first night since the accident, I allowed myself a small permission to imagine that a form of attention might return, but as something altered, as a grammar without certain vowels. The thought was not melodramatic. It was merely a way of arranging hope. It was, perhaps, the first honest thing I had done in a long while. I slept in fits, and the fitful sleep yielded small dreams in which color returned in illogical ways, a child's laugh becoming a smear of orange across a sonata, or a doorbell turning a phrase into green. In the morning the colors did not stay, but the appointment was fixed, and with it a calendar entry that turned absence into a thing one could point to and schedule around. I would go. I would be examined. I would, in all likelihood, be given language with which to describe what had happened to me. Whether that language would be honest or merely clinical would be decided later. There remains in me the odd, almost petty, belief that saying no to spectacle is a moral good. But there are degrees of refusal. To retreat until the world forgets you is itself a kind of submission. Marta did not offer a heroic alternative. She offered small bureaucratic acts, a phone call, a booked appointment, the framing of a narrative that might yet allow me to breathe. The kettle on the stove pinged as it had the week before. I set the cup down and watched the steam lift in a small, white column and into the indifferent light. The tea tasted of nothing special. I drank it and counted the old habit, only now the counts served another purpose. They were a way to measure time into tolerable sections, go to the appointment, listen, bring questions. Later, perhaps, I would practice again. For the present, the act of answerability, the promise to go and speak with a professional, was the smallest evidence of movement I had allowed myself. It would have to be enough for now. When the day ended and the building settled into deeper quiet, I stood once more before the piano. I did not play. Instead, I opened the fallboard and brushed a cloth lightly over the keys, as if my touch could restore a sheen. It did not. But the motion was a small ceremony of fidelity, to enter the room of my profession and not demand of it a miracle it would not produce. There are stages to grief that run in awkward parallels with practical life: inventory, denial, bargaining, and then a drudge of work. I did not know which stage I occupied, and perhaps it matters less than the fact that I woke the next day and made tea again. The decision to move was perhaps no more than that, the intention to perform, however modestly, the steps people call responsible. Marta had given me a calendar entry. I had promised to appear. The next question, whether music could be music to me again, had become the structure of the week ahead. At the door, as if to punctuate the evening, a neighbor returned a lost book with a polite knock and the murmured good night. The small exchange felt oddly like a benediction. I closed the door, locked it, and on the inner side ran my finger lightly along the notch in the frame where the varnish had worn. It was an old habit of counting points of wear in the furniture. I counted them now and let the numbers be a comfort. The city outside went on. Inside, the flat kept its unremarkable light as if the day had not altered anything. I turned off the lamp. In the dark, I repeated the counting one last time and let myself fall somewhere between the certainty of what was lost and the small, bureaucratic surety of an appointment on Thursday morning. I learned early to keep a ledger. It began, as many habits do, as an answer to practical disorder, a list of pieces to prepare, a timetable of practice. errands folded into blocks of time, and it survived into the present as a way of making sense of a life whose most decisive instrument had fallen silent. There is a cleanliness to a list that grief, for all its ragged insistence, cannot entirely disturb. If I write down the hours I will stand at the piano, the exercises I will repeat, the small domestic tasks that must be done, then there is a shape to the day that insists on being real. The ledger is not consolation, it is accounting, it is the least I can do to keep the world legible. My flat is, in consequence, an archive of narrow certainties. Scores lie open on the piano, not because I expect to read color from them now that possibility has been extinguished, but because their presence anchors me. There is a sort of ritual in opening a page and letting the notation breathe in the room. The clef becomes a talisman, the rest's a map of the spaces I can no longer cross the way I once did. I leave a page at Chopin where the rubato once bent apricot into a swell, and pass by it as though it were a photograph of a past self, recognizably the same, yet with a quality of distance that makes me watch it as a spectator would watch a friend at a table in a cafe. I have rehearsed the motions of normal life so precisely they begin to resemble practice. I iron shirts with the same attention to pressure and beat that I once gave to a trill. I count silently before making the tea, the way I counted before an unfamiliar cadence. Counting is a small anchor against the vertigo of an ordinary day. My walks are timed to the minute, the route to the baker, the path along the canal. The library where I sit for an hour with a book about a composer I never studied closely, a way to keep my mind occupied without surrendering to the fantasies that the cameras insist upon. Routine is not a cure, it is a boundary. Memory returns in fragments and in unexpected weather. Sometimes a single detail will open a room. The sound of a staircase foot, that precise metallic cadence, will bring back the conservatory corridor in which I spent my adolescence, damp stone, a smell of polish. The low hum of a harmonium in a practice room that belonged to a woman who taught counterpoint and refused to smile. I will remember a lesson in which a young tutor, impatient but exacting, tapped my wrist to teach a relaxed wrist for the Liszt scales. His hand smelled faintly of tobacco. Once, during a run of recitals, a reviewer wrote that my left hand had the color of winter light. I used to think the phrase awkwardly elliptical until I realized how literal it had been. For me, the left hand did often arrive as steel blue. There are domestic memories that come with a particular warmth. My mother Elizabeth, though she always preferred, simply muttered to anything that sounds more public, noticed things before anyone else did. When I was small, she once stopped me in the middle of supper and said, "Why do you look at the soup like it knows something?" I had been looking at the steam and thinking, absurdly, of the way certain vowels smelled of lavender. She laughed then, not unkindly, and fetched an extra spoon and set it beside me on the saucer as if to mark me as a curiosity in the house's order. She will not have known the word for synesthesia. She had fewer words for rare conditions than the hospital would later produce. She had instead a patience, a domestic intelligence that could fold a child's oddities into the day and keep the household moving. It is her voice that I hear when I make lists, precise, matter-of-fact, the voice that can say, "You must not leave the windows open in March, the cold catches the piano strings." The ledger of memory is not chronological, it is associative, like the body that once received cross-sensory signals and integrated them without analysis. A child's joke will suddenly triangulate a moment in an exam hall. The crack of a rail carriage will remind me of a discarded sonata, and the exact shade I once saw when a chord resolved. Such associations are less frequent now than they used to be. What was once automatic requires effort, an act of willfulness that feels foreign and exhausting. Sleep is thin. Nights are divided into rituals that read like rehearsals of their own. I make my bed precisely, smoothing the linen as if practicing scales. I place the same cup on the bedside table, even when I do not mean to drink from it. When I wake, I count the hours I have left before a doctor's appointment or a phone call. There are nights when I wake in the middle and imagine the colors that used to come with a certain passage in E-flat that was always mauve. a tremolo that flared orange, and for a moment I have the small, dazzling sensation of them returning. It is brief, and the sensation evaporates like breath on glass, which leaves me with a double deprivation, both the loss itself and the memory that it can still, for a heartbeat, exist. That ghost is the cruelest kind of hunger. I have moments when shame lodges like a splinter. It is not the grand shame the papers propose that I might have been responsible for a public misfortune, though that accusation circles me in less direct ways. Rather, my shame is small and social, a laugh I do not meet with confidence, a question I answer with delay. The look of a barista when I stare at a menu as though it were in a language I once read fluently but cannot now. The other day a child at the bakery, having seen me fumble, asked her mother in a tone of blunt clarity, "Why is that man looking so tired?" Her mother hushed her with an embarrassed hand. I returned my gaze to the counter, suddenly aware that the presence of the world demands explanations I cannot easily give. There was a time not so long ago when I would have made a joke about this, turned it into a wry aside in a conversation, and the humor would have smoothed the moment. Humor came easily when the interior map was intact because I could read the world for private amusement. Now the risk of saying something misaligned with the reality of others feels higher. I sometimes imagine that I have become unreadable in the way I once considered music to be readable. The channels that connected me with other people have been rerouted, and, in consequence, the simplest social gestures require effort and translation. People have suggestions. Marta calls, practical and brusque, and suggests a limited list of things I might do to keep afloat in public life. Appearances, she says, pronouncing the word with a fatigued impatience that implies both business and care. There is always an immediately practical strategy in her voice, a rehearsal schedule, a brief statement to release to the press, a list of spokespeople who will take calls. I find these proposals useful only to the extent that they give me something to cross out on a page. Crossing things out is a small pleasure. Other voices are less helpful. Friends and colleagues, with varying degrees of delicacy, tell me that I must be patient with myself, that art is not always about the grand gesture, that time may bring back certain patterns. Their kindness is sincere but also slightly abstracted. The language of consolation rarely touches the particularity of losing exactly the palette that had been the medium and the signature of creation. If someone tells me, "You'll be surprised what returns," I want to ask, surprised how? By what mechanism does a private cartography reconstitute itself? But such questions sound in ordinary conversation like complaints, so I keep them for myself and for the pages of a small notebook where I list failed attempts and small gratitudes. Tea brewed at 8:05, walk along Canal 920 practice. 10 minutes scales, 5 minutes arpeggios. The ledger has a secondary function. It is a place to record the color of memory in language where color itself has become unreliable. Blue is an inadequate word for some recollections. Indigo is not precise enough for others. My old perceptions were always nuanced beyond common vocabulary at C-sharp that suggested not only indigo but a texture of indigo. A kind of oil sheen in the sense, and trying to translate that into prose is a betrayal of the thing itself. Still, writing helps. I write the names of passages beside the hues I once perceived, and then annotate them with associations, a smell, a touch, the weight of a particular finger movement. It is a form of excavation. I am, in short, preparing for an appointment I have delayed for weeks. The hospital has its own ledger, a bureaucracy of forms and typed instructions, the same kinds of measured lists I find so comforting. The waiting room smells of antiseptic and coffee, and the magazines glossy, indifferent lie on the table like small islands of public life. I have read this room before in different circumstances. The architecture is familiar and therefore oddly disarming. When my name is called, I stand and walk with the slow attention of someone who has practiced a movement until it becomes ceremonial. Driere. Newman receives me with a measured, almost repertorial calm. He speaks in a voice designed to be neither dramatic nor trivializing. His vocabulary is the precise, neutral language of medicine, etiology, neuroplasticity, functional mapping. It is not that his words are cruel. They are mercifully absent of the airy consolations of friends. He sits opposite me, hands folded, a screen behind him that at times shows a simplified diagram of the brain, as if to make the thing less abstract by rendering it in maps and colors that belong to somebody else's life. He asks me to describe my symptoms, which I do in the only way I have left that feels honest, by describing the absence. There is sound, I tell him, clear, precise, but hollow. Where there used to be color, there is a ledger of silence. I struggle to make the loss sound literal because it is literal to me. He listens without surprise. His face does not register astonishment so much as clinical interest. Could you describe, he says after a moment, how long you perceived these cross-sensory experiences prior to the incident? I answer, and in answering I return to my own history, the child who saw the note as blue, and the young man who organized programs around the chromatic personalities of composers. He nods, making notes. It is at once comforting and alienating that he can translate my particularity into a category. Synesthesia, he says finally, and the word lands on the page between us with the chiming finality of a bell. He explains, in the careful cadences of his profession, that the brain sometimes organizes sensory input differently, that there can be cross-activations of areas responsible for color and sound, and that trauma to the auditory system or to networks that integrate auditory and visual stimuli can cause a disruption. He speaks of case studies, probabilities, and an inventory of tests, MRI electroencephalography, functional assessments. He maps possible courses, spontaneous recovery, partial compensation via rehabilitation, and the patient work of learning new cues. His words are an education and a narrowing at once. On the one hand, to put a name to the condition gives it a place in the world of public knowledge. It converts a private wonder into a matter that can be studied and perhaps, in some ways, mitigated. On the other hand, the translation flattens nuance. Synesthesia is a useful term, certainly, but it is also a category in which the idiosyncratic texture of my perception risks being lost. Where previously experience arrived in living color and texture, the term places it under glass and labels it. I ask the questions I can imagine asking. How likely is recovery, I say? What do the tests reveal? Are there rehabilitative practices? He answers with a gentleness that does not equivocate on probability. Partial reconfiguration is possible, he says. We can work on training certain associations and on compensatory strategies. But wholesale restoration is unlikely. The brain is plastic, mere color, but it is not a blank slate to be redrawn at will. He uses the pronoun that places me into a population and thereby diminishes the private geometry of my loss. I listen and feel the tilt of my life shift beneath me. At the end of the appointment, he leans forward, and for a brief instant the clinical mask softens into something almost like interest. You are a musician, he says. That matters. Rehabilitation is not merely about sensation. It is about the meanings you attach to sensation. If you can engage the emotional memory that accompanied those perceptions, we can orient the training toward what is most salient to you. He does not offer miracles. He offers, instead, a set of modest, practical steps, tests scheduled for the coming week, recommendations for a therapist familiar with sensory loss, and an outline of exercises we might use to build alternate associations. I leave with a paper packet that smells faintly of glue and bureaucracy. Its contents are sensible and necessary in the way that a list of phone numbers is sensible in an emergency. They are instructions for navigating a terrain I had not wished to have to traverse. Walking back into the street, the city feels both familiar and slightly strange. The ledger of my day resumes. I cross off the appointment, fold the paper into my inner pocket, and return to the scores on the piano at home. There is a peculiar consolation in naming. The word synesthesia gives the loss a structure. It is both a relief and another kind of constraint. I find that I am less inclined now to the half-fantastical explanations I used to indulge in when I wanted to flatter myself about talent. At the same time, the diagnosis sends a cold little shiver through the habit of my life. A confirmation that the thing that made me myself had been grounded in neural patterns susceptible to injury. it is both truer and less satisfying to learn that the marvel was merely a pattern of activation. The ledger grows. New lists appear, tests to be made, appointments to be kept, exercises to attempt. Yet the older lists remain, the scores left open, the precise times for walks, the small domestic rituals that keep the day from dissolving into rumination. In the evenings, I sit with a score and a cup of tea and try to remember not the colors at the edge of sounds, which now betray me by absence, but the way those colors changed my choices. Certain programs in my career were not merely aesthetic preferences. They were selections made because the chromatic personality of a work resonated with my private palate. To remake those choices is to reconfigure not merely what I play but why I play it. The chapter of my life titled before closes with this sober ledger and a fragile, budding curiosity. The appointment has framed the absence as something to be investigated. It has also, inevitably, placed me into a public category that will be spoken about politely at parties and professionally in the corridors of the conservatory. That is the next ledger I will attend to: how to live in a world that can name your wound and therefore has the temerity to advise you how to treat it. For the moment, however, the page is blank and the scores on the piano are waiting. I close the evening with the smallest of practices, 5 minutes at the keys, a slow, patient scale, fingers finding their old coordinates even if the map they once consulted has gone. The sound is accurate, the color is absent. Nevertheless, I count and feel the small persistence of muscle and will. When I go to bed, I keep the pages of my ledger close. I put my hand on them as if it could call back a memory. There is no dramatic resolution in such an act. It is rather a modest claim. I am here, still willing to record, to attempt to wait. The final line I write before sleep, a tender, bureaucratic phrase, is simply, begin again at 800. The command is modest. But it is also the first act of a patient architecture of repair. I do not know what will come of it, only that a life comprised of small, disciplined acts may yet outlast the suddenness of loss. Outside, the city sleeps, indifferent and steady, and I hold in my chest the strange, private ache of absence and the smaller, stubborn expectation that work can, in time, make a place for what remains. There is a particular kind of silence that proceeds from being read. I had been read all my life by critics, by audiences, by colleagues, but this reading had always been of the work I made, and the private geometry that made it possible. The color in my head was a language no one else could learn. When I played, the hall accepted a translation and applauded the fidelity of what I offered. When the colors went, I discovered that the public could read the absence as easily as it once read the sound. They read it as scandal, as culpability, as failure. The first official voice to arrive at my door was Inspector Hollers. He came with a courtesy that suggested a ritual, appointment book precision, the small bow of a man delivering civic business. He had not the grimness of an executioner nor the curiosity of a social animal. Rather, he possessed the impersonal patience of someone accustomed to fitting human complexity into forms. He sat on the edge of my settee, his notebook resting on his knees like an instrument he intended not to play but to consult. The light in the room was generous, refusing the drama of shadows. Perhaps he, too, thought that a well-lit room would be less likely to court melodrama. "Her caller," he said, and it was an introduction both formal and spare. "I understand you have given a preliminary statement at the hall. I need to take a fuller account for the file. There are questions that remain." He placed a card on the coffee table, thin typeface, a functionary's card stripped of flourish. I had rehearsed this encounter in the private theater of my mind a dozen ways, defiant and eloquent, contrite and humble, professorial and dry. None of them corresponded to what happened. I found myself watching the small, factual movements of the man's hands as he wrote down the dates I had already given, the program, the timing between movements, the names of the stagehands who had been present. He asked for the names of those I had seen in the corridor, asked, carefully, about the exact sequence of what I remembered before the accident and what followed. I answered as I could. I told him honestly, the fragments of a map but no contiguous route. Memory, in the hours that followed the incident, had been a room whose furniture had been shifted. He did not press for theatrical confession. Instead, he requested, politely and insistently, that I make myself available for further interviews and for any identification lineups the inquiry might require. "We must ensure that every element has been considered," he said. "There is, as you know, a procedural obligation to the families involved. Even memory that feels private can have public consequence." His hands were steady, the notebook becoming the repository of a civic ledger in which my life had been entered. When he left, I felt as if a small door had closed behind him. There was a bureaucratic finality to the visit that made the apartment seem smaller. A day later, an official letter came, stamped, precise, requesting more formal documentation. The city moved in its own rhythm and its own grammar. I was, from that point, its subject. Not long after, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. On the other end was a voice that made me want to be less solitary in a new way. Eager, lubricated with the collateral warmth of curiosity. Felix Jern introduced himself as a culture writer. His name had appeared before in profiles. He had a reputation for turning personal collapse into narrative shape. "Her caller," he said. "I don't want to smell blood in the water. People are looking for a story. If you're willing, I can offer the chance to tell it your way. An interview off the record, if you prefer, might be useful, to explain, perhaps, what happened that night." His voice was sympathetic, but there was steel beneath it. I declined. I had imagined saying no and being left alone. Instead, the request multiplied into a dozen others' emails, a message on the conservatory's answering machine, a polite harassment that never quite looked like malice. Felix, persistent in the way of men who make living from other people's truths, sent follow-ups. Once I conceded to meet him for an iced coffee at an institutionally bland cafe near the museum quarter. He arrived with the professional's toolkit, notepad, recorder discreetly placed, a small smile that invited confession. Felix was, superficially, an uncomplicated adversary. He wanted narrative arcs. He wanted a fall and a possible redemption, because those made tidy copy. He showed me, beneath his notebook, what he thought the public might accept, culpability softened by human frailty, an arc from catastrophe to repentance to revival. People like an arc, he observed. They need cause and effect. Right now there's a hole where the story should be and it's making them restless. Filling it will generate sympathy, acting as revenue if you prefer sympathy to venom. He was both mercenary and oddly candid. I told him I had nothing for him. What I could not say, could not bear to say in a cafe with a buzzy air conditioner and the smell of burnt milk, was that the part of me that had once made sense of the world was now a ledger of blank rows. Felix tried to joke about this, offering the journalists consolation that loss could be aestheticized. "You used to say in interviews," he said, leaning in, "that your synesthesia was like a private map. People like maps. They're distressing when blank." He tapped his pen for emphasis. I left feeling scraped by the public appetite. Felix would write, but he would need shape, and if I could not provide it, he would improvise. If Felix represented the pressing gaze of the press, Marta Weiss represented the restlessness of the market. She arrived on a rain-heavy afternoon with an umbrella that left a dark semicircle on the mat. Marta had managed me for years. She had the natural impatience of someone whose career had been dedicated to turning art into schedules and schedules into income. There are mercies to be found in such practical minds. She sat and looked at me as if measuring whether the man in front of her was salvageable or simply a liability. "Matthias," she said, "we need to talk about narrative. The board is nervous. They all ask what's next. I have a few ideas that are discreet and tasteful. An intimate return, controlled press, a charitable framing. We can stage it so that you are seen as courageous rather than culpable." She spoke with the same economical tenderness as a surgeon. The suggestion, because it was calibrated and commercial, felt precisely the sort of thing that invited me to barter pieces of myself. I told Marta that there were aspects of the past that could not be punctiliously arranged. My silence was not merely tactical. It was substantive, a loss of literal input. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice. You don't have to be the same pianist. We can craft a different public. People are forgiving if they can